Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalat, wassalam, ala rasulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah kathiran, inna alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina, man yahdihillahu fala mudilla lahu wa man yudlil fala hadiya lahu, wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. Alhamdulillah. After praising Allah and sending blessings upon His beloved Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, I'd like to thank the leadership of the Islamic Center of Irving and my beloved brother Mubarak for this invitation tonight to share with you some thoughts on the topic of keeping the faith, our children, and the challenge of Islamic education. Keeping the faith, our children, and the challenge of Islamic education. I come representing the Islamic Seminary of America. I brought my board chair, Dr. Iqbal Yunus. He's here somewhere. Some of you already know him because he's been a national leader on the scene with ISNA and other projects over the many years. And so what I'd like to do is call your attention to some very important issues and also talk about the Islamic Seminary of America in that particular context. I'd like to talk about keeping the faith, our children, and the challenge of higher education by focusing on three things. One, the whole issue is the context. Two is the culture, and three, the challenges. Number one is the context in which we live. Two is the culture in which we live, and three are the challenges. So let's start with the context. It's been almost 60 years, I can't believe it, 6 decades since I set forth on a college campus. I went to what's called the HBCU, a historically black college or university, in Virginia, called then Hampton Institute, now called Hampton University. When I went from my home, I lived in Roanoke, Virginia, to Hampton, Virginia, I did not realize how different life on campus would be from the life that I was living back home. That's still true. If you're sending your child away to college, or if you're a young person going away to college for the first time, understand that living on a college campus and living at home are two dramatically different things. Living on a college campus and living at home are two dramatically different things. And we can talk about this in the Q&A. And so when I went to Hampton University so many years ago, I checked in what was called James Hall. My name is James Jones. I lived in James Hall. We call ourselves freshmen back then. We call them first-year students now. And this hall was located on one side of the campus. Across the campus was something called Virginia Cleveland Hall. And I do mean across the campus, not on the same side of the campus. You had to walk across the campus. Why did I mention these two halls? Because James Hall at that time was for males only, and Virginia Cleveland Hall at that time was for females only. At the time that I went to school, there was something called in loco parentis, INLOCOPARETI, parentis, TIS. In loco parentis. It's a Latin phrase that means that the school saw themselves as your parents. So you went from your parents' home, you went to the school, and the school, particularly during this time, were in the conservative schools, like the one I went to, were looking after your moral education. So therefore, if you went to Hampton Institute at this particular time, and you found yourself on the wrong side of the campus, that is, I lived on the James Hall side, and there was the Virginia Cleveland Hall side, you would get demerits for that because they were trying to make sure that there was no mixing, that there was no social mixing after sundown, at what we call Maghrib, on these campuses. Times have changed in the past 6 decades. But I want you to understand that context is everything, and that even today, even though things have changed on college campuses, when you move from the college campus, from your home to the college campus, things are very, very different. I happened to go back to Hampton on my 25th class reunion, and they had built a dormitory in the middle of the campus, James Hall on one side, Virginia Cleveland on the other side, and W.E.B. Du Bois, named after a famous black scholar, in the middle, which was a co-ed dormitory. Now, we'd never heard of this thing when I was going to school. Now they have co-ed, not only co-ed dormitories, but co-ed suites at Yale University in New Haven, where I live, one of my alma mater. So things have changed dramatically. But even that co-ed dormitory in the middle of Hampton Institute, it meant that young men were on one floor, young women on another floor, young men on one floor, young women on another floor. And so there was this notion, still a little bit of in loco parentis, making sure, looking out for the moral life of the students. So why am I pretty concerned about you thinking about if you're sending your child off, if you're going off to school for the first time? Things have even changed in the past 10 or 15 years. For 30 years, I worked as a professor at a school called Manhattanville College in New York, and we would take freshmen on campus, and they would go to something called Spelman Hall, and this was a co-ed dormitory for the first-year students. These students, the males and females, 18-year-olds, they lived on the same floor. They didn't live in the same suites, but they lived on the same floor, and they did not have bathrooms in their room, and so they had to go down the hall and go to the bathroom. Now, I'm just describing something to you, and I want you to think about this in terms of young men and young women, and this is not unusual to have co-ed dormitories for first-year students, right? I want you to think about the impact of this, because these young men and young women at 18 years old had never been away from home, stayed this long, and been in this close proximity to young men and women at their age who were not related to them. And so what would happen in that hall, because I lived in that hall briefly at one time, is that, and I lived in a suite that had its own bathroom, but young men and young women would come out of their rooms in various stages of undress to go down the hall to the bathroom, to go down the hall to take a shower. So you can understand that if you're sending your child off to school, many schools are like this. And I'm just want you to understand what your child is getting into, or what, if you're a student, what you're getting into. It's very, very different at home. On top of it, the moral values that have shifted on campus, so that the whole idea around gender and sex is a very, what we call progressive idea. And so if you should understand that that's what you're dealing with. So that's the context that you're dealing with. The culture in which we live has changed dramatically over the past 20 years or so. I'm talking about the general United States culture. And I have a PowerPoint that Brother Mubarak, if you want, he'll share it with you. Just reach out to him. I'll send it to him. I just didn't bring my connector so you could see it yourself. And so, because I'm going to talk about a few books that I would recommend that you take a look at in terms of thinking about going off to college or either sending your child off to college. One book is called The Culture of Disbelief. The Culture, C-U-L-T-U-R-E, of Disbelief, written by a former faculty member at Yale Law School. And it's about the idea, he wrote it in the 1990s, that many people in this society are pressured to act as if their faith is a hobby, H-O-B-B-Y, that it doesn't matter, that it's something I should have on the side. The people who are so strident about their faith in the public square these days, in situations like the Roe versus Wade situation on the United States Supreme Court, are often people who are very, very, quote, religious, but what I would call what Stephen Carter would call, they do political preaching. That is, they decide what their position is, and then they take from their religion in order to support their position. And so this kind of idea that either you do political preaching, you take a position, and then you take it, and then you take it and you use it instead of your values, is something that's very prevalent. Or on the other side, if you talk too much about your religion in the public, people won't like it. It's called the culture of disbelief. Another thing that's happened in American culture in the past 30 or 40 years is something I would call, and I agree with this author, the collapse of parenting, right? It's a book called The Collapse of Parenting, wherein many parents, they want to be buddies, and this is a non-Muslim medical doctor who wrote this book. They want to be the buddies of their children rather than the parent. And so what we're looking for is a balance between making sure that your youngsters have values and making sure, and boundaries, and make sure that they feel loved. We're looking for this in Islam as well, and there are several Muslims who've written books on parenting that point in this particular direction. So the outcome of all of this is two things I'd like to talk about before we talk about some things we might be able to do about it. Number one is that an organization called FYI commissioned a study in 2014, it's been a while ago, of students on college campus. And what they found that when it comes to engaging in things that Islam is against, we found that students on college campuses, Muslim students on college campuses, often engaged in some of these activities in the following numbers. This is 2014, 46.2% admitted to drinking alcohol in the past year. 24.6%, or about 1 in 4, admitted to illicit or illegal drug use. 30.4%, about a little less than 1/3, admitted to gambling in the previous year. And amongst the never married Muslims who went to college, 58.5% had engaged in sexual intercourse. These are large numbers, and this was in 2014, before some shifts have come about in our society. And so I'm not saying that you shouldn't send your child away to college. I'm not saying that if you're a young person, you shouldn't go to college. But I'm saying that if you go, you should go with your eyes wide open, and you should think about what you're going to do about these particular situations that you'll find yourself in, because there's pressure to do all of these things when you go away to college. There's pressure to drink. There's pressure to take illicit drugs. There's pressure to engage in sexual activities. There's pressure to gamble. There's pressure to do, and amongst the people who did these things, about 77% of those people who did these things at least once did them at least twice. And so my point is that if you're sending a youngster away to school, or if you're going away to school, you should understand that you're going to face things that you didn't normally face in this community in Irving, right? And you're going to face them constantly. And because of the change in laws, the past 10 or 15 years, laws regarding drugs like marijuana have been loosened up all over the United States. And so it's getting harder and harder for somebody who feels that they need to keep their deen, their religion, to keep their deen, when now things that were illegal at one time are now legal in many states, and many of the states that people are going to. And so this is the situation that we're talking about. One of the ways of thinking about what to do about this as parents is to think about Surah Kahf, right? We try to read this every Jummah, and I think this is one way of thinking about dealing with the challenge of what my youngster might face when he or she goes off to college. One way of thinking about this, and one of our faculty colleagues, Imam from Memphis, Tennessee, talks about this often in class. He talks about the fact that in Surah Kaf, you see several different ways of being civically engaged, right? Several different ways of being civically engaged. This is Imam Abdul Malik in Memphis, Tennessee. You look, one situation is the youth who took themselves to the cave, right? They just separated themselves from society. And then you have Khidr, who was in society, who was teaching within society, who was dealing with situations within society. And then you have Dhul Qarnayn, who was given political power and authority by Allah Ta'ala. And so the message that the Imam talked about is that there's not one way to be civically engaged. And I would argue there's not one way to approach the college situation. And I would argue that we should be more cognizant that there are different ways for youngsters to develop themselves and have a career going forward. What does this mean? It means, number one, that we should be careful about imposing on young people a particular career choice simply because we did it. Because they may not have the aptitude, the attitude, or the interest in something that we're interested in. I often ran into young people who were studying to be medical doctors simply because someone in their family wanted them to be a medical doctor. And meanwhile, they were flunking chemistry, they were flunking math, they were flunking biology. But they were having a hard time with the STEM courses, but yet they said, I want to be a medical doctor because someone in the family was pressuring them. I'm saying to the parents that you should think that there are many ways to success. Besides, from our perspective as the Islamic Center of America, we need some of our smart, bright young people to think about being in religious leadership because, in line with our mission of being our vision of being an institution that promotes, religious learning and ethical leadership. And so to parents, please, please, please make sure that you listen to young people and you understand that there's a variety of ways of being successful in this life, and there are varieties of ways of becoming successful that reinforce your ability to be successful in the hereafter. So the other thing I would say to youngsters in terms of challenges, I would offer as an example a book that came out recently by Dr. Yusuf Salam. It's called Better, Not Bitter. It's called Better, Not Bitter. I would recommend it to you. It came out in the past couple of years. It's actually about something that happened quite a while back, something called, we knew very well on the East Coast, called the Central Park Five, wherein a young woman was raped in Central Park, a very famous park in New York City, and left for dead. She did not die. And these 5 young men, young black men and Hispanic men, were falsely accused. It turns out they were falsely accused. They were exonerated about 20 years afterwards, after they spent a great deal of time in jail. The reason why Yusuf Salam's story is so important here is that Yusuf Salam, after being locked away, he was locked away when he was 15 years old, right? And he had a significant chunk of his life taken away from him unjustly. There was no question about it. He came out better, and some of you have heard him talk, maybe seen him on YouTube. He's been associated with Dr. Omar Suleiman. He's been on programs with him. But he came out of that situation better, not bitter. That he remembered the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, whom he was named after, and he invoked his Islamic training and background in terms of dealing with that. And so this is one of the attitudes that we can take as young people, that for whatever reason we've run into situations where we've found that things are not exactly as we think they ought to be, and that's the way the world is, and that we should try to avoid the bitterness and take a positive frame of mind. As I say to the youngsters in my family, you ought to put your Islam to work, that is. You ought to try to look at the positive side of Islam. And Allah Ta'ala talks about who He loves over and over in the Quran, and that this kind of love is something that we should find expressed in our families. But if we don't find it, we should not become bitter about it. So this is one way of approaching it. The other thing I'm reminded of is that aside from the study that was done in 2014, one of my colleagues on the faculty of the Islamic Center of America, Dr. Rania Awad, who is a psychiatrist in California, also on the faculty of an Ivy League institution, that it being Stanford University in California, also classically trained as an Islamic scholar in Syria. She's going around the country doing workshops on suicide prevention. One of the reasons she's doing this is that a couple of years ago, she and another colleague of mine, Ebony Jackson, wrote a study where they found that Muslims were more than 2 times more likely to report to the researchers that they had tried suicide than the Protestants. And this is an important thing for us to think about, and we should be about the business of thinking about why this kind of thing is happening in our community and doing things to prevent it. Inshallah, we're bringing Dr. Rania to DFW in November for a leadership workshop, and part of the workshop will be looking at the history of the impact of Islam on thoughts about psychiatry and psychology. He argues that we help form some of the bases of the best psychology and psychiatry, and some things that we can do about it. And so we ought to be aware of these kinds of things. And I noted that just as I was retiring from the faculty of Manhattanville College, I was noticing much more depression, much more anxiety, much more sort of inability to function because they were feeling overwhelmed by the students that I was dealing with. Remember, I was dealing mainly with 18-year-olds. And so this is a real problem in the broader society, and it's a real problem in our own society. When we look at certain groups in a society, like people who are in the armed forces, people who've been deployed overseas, there's a very, very high rate of suicide for people like this. This is an issue that we need to think about. We need to do what's called mental health first aid training. I've actually done training here in this area over the past few years for mental health first aid, and think about prevention measures to make sure that this doesn't take a great toll on our youngsters, but also short of suicide, just the whole mental frame that we have about Islam. I would say that we should avoid, and I'm not a scholar, but we should avoid presenting Islam as a rule-bound way of life, but it's a complete way of life that solves life's problems, and it's about love for Allah and His Messenger Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. This is the kind of thing we should emphasize. So where does the Islamic Center of America and higher education institutions fit into all of this? If we are serious